Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the National Galleries of Scotland. I'm Lucy Askew, Chief Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art here. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome you for this special lecture by the writer, curator and academic Éric de Chassey to mark the opening of Bridget Riley's landmark retrospective here at the galleries upstairs at the RSA. And it's wonderful to see so many friends of both the gallery excuse me, and of Bridget herself here today. I know many have travelled a far distance to be with us, and so we thank you all for your time this morning. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Bridget herself, firstly for agreeing to stage this show and for working so closely alongside us to realise it. We couldn't have done it without her and her incredibly hardworking and committed team. We first discussed the idea of staging an exhibition with Bridget some 3 years ago or more, after we presented a small display of her paintings at the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art in 2016. And that started a conversation, and we were then delighted to be able to partner with the Hayward Gallery, where the exhibition will go to the South Bank Centre later this year in the autumn, where it will evolve into, I think, a quite different exhibition in those beautiful architectural spaces. The show here has been supported by our friends and the People's Postcode Lottery, and we're incredibly grateful to David Zwerner and Gallery Max Hetzler, and, as I say, to the Artist Studio, who've been so supportive at every stage of the development. I was up in the gallery earlier, and it's wonderful to see people enjoying and looking closely at Bridget's works, and they look magnificent and monumental in the RSA spaces. We're also thrilled to be showing a very extensive number of works on paper, preparatory studies and drawings, and I hope, if you haven't already seen the show, that you will have a very special and rewarding experience. So to help us celebrate today and to consider the work of one of the most acclaimed British artists working today, we are extremely happy to welcome our speaker, Éric de Chassey. Éric is director of the French National Institute of Art History and professor of modern and contemporary art history at the École Normale Supérieure in Lyon, France. Between 2009 and 2015, Éric was director of the French Academy in Rome, Villa Medici. Éric has published extensively on the arts and visual culture across the 20th century right up to the present day, and he's curated numerous exhibitions both in France and across the world. Amongst the many artists whose work he's explored in his writings, the work of Bridget Riley has figured significantly, and not least in his most recent and hugely insightful essay, which you will find in this beautiful catalogue which accompanies the show. We are delighted that Éric is with us. He has travelled a considerable distance to be here, having been in the States only very recently. And so we thank you, Éric, for your time and for agreeing to speak to us. So Éric's going to speak, I think, for 30 or 40 minutes or so, and there will be time for questions at the end. The event is being recorded, so if you do have a question, please wait for the roving mic to reach you so that everyone can hear and it can be recorded for posterity. And in the meantime, please join me in welcoming Éric. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. At the core of Bridget Riley's art lies an apparent paradox. In order to solicit from its viewer the most personal, the most subjective response, it is created in the most impersonal, the most objective manner. Each of the terms of this paradox is debatable. They all need to be specified and contextualized, especially as they seem to run against some of the artist's statements. But I think that they offer a usable framework to understand the remarkable achievements of Riley and the developments of her work since the late 1950s, in their amazing continuity as well as in their successive shifts. In one of her first interviews in 1967, Riley claimed, and I quote, "No matter what I do, it will be subjective, and so to develop as much objectivity as I can is simply counterbalancing this inevitable presence of myself in the work. Depersonalization is, I think, a bogus hue and cry. It's the decisions that are the important factors," end of the quote. Her recognition of the subjective aspect of her work was counterintuitive as, according to the interpretive tradition that became dominant in the 20th century and gained a new momentum with the advent of post-war abstract expressionism, subjectivity in art has been supposed to be embodied in gestures or marks left visible on the canvas, as personal traces enabling the viewer to recognize in the final result the permanent presence of the artist who had made it, in a specific moment and place, as a physical act. Indeed, there have never been any such marks in Riley's painting since 1959. In saying that the decisions are the important factors, Riley did not situate herself either in the counter-tradition of the ready-made, which elevated the individual choice of the artist as a new form of subjectivity. The plural she used in a 1967 statement is extremely important here, as it is the exact opposite of the single initial act based on aesthetic indifference of the ready-made and its descendants. Hers is a succession of interdependent choices based on a subjectivity that constantly adjusts and responds to what is happening around it, instead of creating a situation and letting it develop independently without being transformed by it. In Riley's case, the give and take between a subject, the painter, and an object in the making, an evolving painting, gives rise to a final object, a picture, a tableau, which elicits a give and take between it, the painting, and the subject who stands in front of it, the viewer. The viewer is invited to constantly adjust him or herself through decisions on what to focus on what to let go, which might not even register consciously as decisions, but are such nevertheless. And these decisions shape and reshape his or her subjectivity accordingly. Riley has repeatedly credited her discovery of the paintings of Jackson Pollock shown in the 1958 retrospective exhibition at the Whitechapel Art Gallery in London with her embrace of abstraction as the only possible artistic language. This contact with Pollock's work did not have an immediate impact, though. Contrary to the numerous painters of the second and third generations of abstract expressionism, she seemed to have thought, maybe without formulating it as clearly at the time, that the lesson of Pollock did not consist in displaying one's subjectivity on the canvas by covering it with a whirlwind of brushstrokes, but rather in abandoning a centered viewpoint in favor of a multifocal occupation of the surface and a shallow depth of field, a lesson she explicitly addressed only much later, for the moment turning instead to the lesson of Seurat. And I won't go forward on that aspect, but of course it is central to understanding her work. This relationship of how, touched and marked by Pollock, she chooses to go to Seurat, which is not something obvious. But if you think about multifocality and shallow depth of field, there is something to be understood there. Before embarking on her mature work, Riley nevertheless made at least one attempt at explicitly expressing the subjective through the common device of brushstrokes. In 1960, in a state of creative crisis, she tried to paint a black monochrome painting, where her frustrations were embodied by what she has described as, and I quote, quite violent brush marks done in a particular frame of mind about what she thought she was expressing, end of the quote. It's very likely that we will never know what this or these attempts, she has sometimes used a plural when describing this episode, looked like, as it was or they were destroyed by the artist, who, as explained, and I quote again, when I returned to the studio the next day later, I realized that my painting expressed nothing. It was mute and dead. That made me question it and ask myself what was wrong with it. The painting had no opposition, no contrast, and as a result, there was no movement. But the consequence was paramount to her coming practice. she once told me in 1997, it made, and I quote her, "it made me decide to abandon brushstrokes." In a way, as regards the subjective in Riley's work, this or these destroyed paintings are like a potential black hole against which to gauge her entire oeuvre, a measure of the destructive effects a complete surrender to the subjective could mean for her and her potential viewers. The outcome of this crisis was Kiss, her first black and white painting. A gouache study for this painting shows that Riley worked out its form on gridded paper. The outside corners of the square serve as the impersonal and geometric structure from which stem two black shapes, one rectangular, the other unevenly curved, that do not touch each other. The title, which could be metaphorical of a new state of mind, more literally describes the way these two shapes behave, constituting a new whole. In the final painting, this process is reversed as the white shapes are painted over a continuous field of unmodulated black, exacting a potential reversal of the figure-ground relationship, which depends on the way the viewer focuses alternatively on the white or the black as the active or passive shape. The fact that the white field is unbroken, albeit almost not, plays an essential part here. This painting was certainly the reason why, in 1962, David Sylvester began a review of Riley's exhibition at Gallery 1, London, with the sentence, I quote, "Bridget Riley is a hard-edged abstractionist," a term which had gained currency in Britain thanks to the 1960 Institute of Contemporary Arts exhibition titled West Coast Art Hedge, but also through the exhibition of some paintings by Ellsworth Kelly around the same years. However, it soon became clear on the basis of the paintings that immediately followed Kiss, such as movement in squares, that she had nothing to do with the hard-edged tendency, except in her refusal of the then current vocabulary of expressive brushstrokes, while having not much to do with the continental European tradition of concrete abstraction neither. The impersonal facture of Riley's work since 1961 could be taken as a legacy of this European tradition, a feeling that her participation in the Responsive Eye exhibition might have exacerbated. But as we have just seen, she had arrived at it from a completely different angle, from the black hole of gestural monochrome that we will never see. As late as 1970, Maurice de Sausmarez paired her work with that of Vasarely, though, in a rather ambiguous consideration. Later in and I quote, "Later in this year, 1961, Riley saw reproductions of work by Vasarely for the first time and realized that her own recent work had long been anticipated by this master. Far from being in any way discouraged, she was greatly sustained by this knowledge and keen to pursue an independent development." End of the quote. But contrary to the French-Hungarian artists or his disciples in the Groupe de Recherche d'Art Visuel, Riley's consistent choice of a non-personal facture never partook of a desire for anonymity subsumed in a group work, based on what the 1960 Articles of Foundation of the Groupe de Recherche d'Art Visuel described as, I quote, "organized research, geared towards the establishment of," I quote again, "a solid fundamental goal at once theoretical and practical that could encompass the use of machine or computer-assisted creation." Riley chose a working method very early on that can reconcile a certain tendency towards purity, or more specifically, the use, I quote, "of means that were sufficiently purified," to use her words from 1995, and feeling, or finding a way to make, I quote again, "plastic relationships expressive in themselves." Her working process is characterized by a professional way to assess as objectively as possible the inherent rightness of feeling reached at each step. What she calls an inquiry, the exploration of, I quote, the potential of an element, and then gradually several elements. That is a type of subjective objectivity, as can be seen in her comments on the cartoons for the 1980 K series of paintings. I quote, "The width of the stripes was varied, and it was discovered that only the study with equal width stripes appeared to have space and dynamism. The one with variable width stripes looks flat and inert. It has an easy, decorative charm, but lacks the muscle of the other." From 1961 on, Riley has always strived for neutral, objective handling of the pictorial means, which are rendered as pure as possible, without facture, so that the elements that compose her pictures can be stated as objective facts, that is, devoid of anything that would distract the viewer from looking at them as they are, without bringing into this visual activity any outside meanings, either in a figurative way, referencing something that happens outside the artwork, or as traces of the initial presence of another person, the artist in this case. One has only to look at the paintings of the British artists she was initially associated with, often far from being perfectly executed, to see the difference. Indeed, since 1961, right after Movement in Squares, Riley has been using assistants to help her realize her work. In 1988, she stated, and I quote, "It's actually bringing this sensation into existence that is the difficulty, what Cézanne called realization." End of the quote. It should be made clear that Riley's work with assistants is rather singular and different from traditional studio practices. She does not use them to do only the preparatory work, such as stretching and priming canvases, or mixing the colors, keeping for herself the actual task of painting and letting her hand show, even if remotely. That's the way, for instance, someone like Kelly, whose painting I showed, Rebound, used to work. Nor does she restrict them to finalizing the paintings, preserving for herself the moments of studies. Like, I don't know, we saw some dot paintings by Riley. That's the way someone like Damon Hirst is writing, is working for his dot paintings. Nor does she assign them the task of making replicas or versions that would enable her to cope with commissions, as it was traditional to do at the time of Titian or Rubens, assigning different values to works she would make herself and others left over to assistants. Indeed, if there exist several replicas of some of her paintings, either made on the spot or much later, they are made in no different ways than the original works. They exist because the artist needs to look at a lost painting and thinks that her viewers should be able to experience a work that is not available for various reasons, or because she feels the need for a new experience of a past work. And that's the case, for instance, with Vapor. And the two versions, which are quite different, they are not strictly replicas. Instead of those traditional studio practices, she involves herself, as Robert Kudelka explains, in the, I quote him, "in the execution of the work at all stages, from the priming to the final stretching and cleaning of the canvas, primarily in order to keep the various stages of the work better in view, and moreover because exclusive concentration on looking, essential though the eye may be, would contradict its very purpose. But she does so, and I quote again Kudelka, only occasionally, which means that there's no complete logic in this getting involved. The importance is the possibility to intervene at each stage and the possibility to let go at each stage also. And that's also, I think, something that's reflected in the experience of the viewer. Riley herself has made clear that her recourse to assistance is linked with the possibility of exercising purity of vision. I quote, "It seemed to me an inevitable step to lay my own hands aside and ask someone else to paint the work out. It didn't need to be one particular person. It could be anybody whom I had trained to apply the paint without emphasis and with no trace of handling. The way that I work means that I am inevitably my own spectator. Since the spectator who looks at my work is part of the work itself, it helps very greatly to be as objective as I possibly can. Nevertheless, I want my work to be perceived as made things." But she has also emphasized that this exercise of vision is first and foremost an exercise of judgment. I quote her again. Both quotes are from the same period, 2004-2005. "My main activity in the studio is the exercise of judgment, pure judgment. It can properly be called pure because, like pure color, such judgment is distinguished by having no referential role outside the work itself." Let me go back to one slide. Nope, no, this one, which might make it possible to understand maybe very quickly. I won't go into details, but I just want to say that the full-scale model in the upper right, that you see at the upper right part of the slide, was supposed to be a finished model. And in fact, to be transformed into the wall painting, it underwent a very slight modification, which is very important. And that's exactly in this way that she can work. And for some of the larger works, this is done via cutouts and this kind of setup in the studios at first with scaled model and then at full scale. Indeed, her need for objectivity and impersonalized or depersonalized handling, impersonalized or depersonalized in the sense that each task is done by a person, but that the identity of that person, at least the identity as we recognize it by implying a name to its authorship of an act, does not matter, does come from the same impulse that she clearly stated in relation to her abstract use of geometric forms and discrete colors. And that's a quote from 1974. When I started around 1960, forms such as triangles, squares, circles, rhomboids, etc., were no longer burdened by the heavy load of associations and symbolic overtones which they had carried in the 1920s and 1930s as constructivist motifs. There were simple forms without any pretensions, in a condition for working with, just to hand. What's interesting is that even with such freeing of the forms from any references, it doesn't prevent her to bring them when the whole painting is made to some kind of relationship with some existing previous paintings by other artists. And in this case, Rêve, you have an obvious reference at one point with the use of the French to the work of Matisse, for instance. There are only three persons, or instances, if one prefers a more neutral term, who count in her work. Herself, when she is making decisions, and they are very factual ones. The viewer, when he or she is in front of the painting, and the first viewer is the artist herself, and the painting itself, as it is not considered a passive recipient of actions, but an active agent that suggests and demands specific actions. The other individuals, including the artist when she is physically making something, only count as tools of the decisions of these three persons or instances. Not much different from the cutout painted papers she has gathered since the 1980s as a bank of forms to work with and from, especially for this series of painting. It is because Riley's paintings are the result of a give and take between these three instances or persons that the artist can, and sometimes has to, intervene at each step of this trialogue, a term I derive from Mondrian, who wrote such a trialogue in 1919-1921, while also keeping an objective distance at each step. Riley's trialogical painting is convened around and on visual facts and events that are created by these objective and discrete facts. What I want to conclude with is how this development amounts to a powerful redefinition, or rather redefinitions as they did evolve in time, of the entanglements of subjectivity and the visual. In a way, Riley has bet everything on the value of vision. She concluded her first substantial statement in 1965 with this assertion, and I quote, "Ultimately, the degree of visual sensibility is the vital agent in transforming a concept into the indefinable experience which is presented by a work of art." End of the quote. In Riley's art, the gives and takes between the three agents of the artwork have thus remained centered on the visual at the very moment when the oculocentric tradition that defined Western thought was challenged, with an accrued momentum since the 1960s. It could be said that Riley's position, like that of many artists of her generation, starts from a vantage point that is rather similar to that of the philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Riley's insistence on the bodily implications and effects of vision in the 1960s parallels Merleau-Ponty's idea that there exists, I quote, a reflexivity of the sensible, that vision is a conditioned thought. It is born as occasioned by what happens in the body. It is incited to think by the body, end of the quote. At the same time, though, this embodied I is also, quite contradictorily, a discentered I. And that is the major aspect of her redefinition of the visual. The way in which, as a very young student, she copied the portrait by Jan van Eyck, commonly known as Man in a Red Turban, is relevant here. First, because she excluded the frame with its reflexive inscriptions leading back to a single author, which is why this painting is so important in the history of Western painting, or this is why this painting is usually commented upon as being crucial to the history of Western painting, this Johannes de Eyck me fecit. And second, because she emphasized and proportionally enlarged the color garment to the detriment of the face and the vestments, creating several focal points where there had only been one in Van Eyck's painting. Of course, this is not a completely conscious decision at this stage. I don't believe that. But it is significant about the way she's looking at things. Riley never aligned herself with the centered perspectival tradition, itself closely linked with what became the stable subject of the philosopher Descartes. Rather, she quickly embraced what she called, as early as 1967, a multifocal space, which became more and more a polyfocal space, as the black and white paintings from the 1960s, which still stated a basis before negating it, gave way to color compositions where the eye constantly switches its spaces while laterally scanning the surface, so that the very notion of center and periphery became relative and interchangeable. If in the 1970s and 1980s, the attacks on the centered subject waged by French philosophers such as Foucault, Deleuze, and Derrida, to quote another triad, went hand in hand, a sacred triad, went hand in hand with a defiance against vision, Riley has concretely, that is, in painting, not in theory, reconciled this decentering with the exercise of the eye. Starting with the curve and stripe series of the late 1960s, which return in different guises over the years, her paintings negate the centrality of the self and its stability by showing, concretely again, that vision is a negotiation and not a stable fact, because subjectivity is a negotiation too, between objective facts and subjective responses, not as separated according to a theoretical divide, but as different moments that together constitute, build, and redefine each instance of the trilogical paintings. In her work, vision is courted and created as a contradictory sense that happens and changes in several places and several moments, even if the means are extremely reduced, as in the measure for measure series. And that resonates with a polycentric universe where the human is no longer the center, while preserving the possibility of subjectivity through the paradoxical affirmation of objectivity, in times when bureaucratization and commodification of everything, from humankind to landscape, transformed into manageable and saleable assets, are reigning supreme. Very rightly, Kudielka remarked in 1978, I quote, "It is this fading of the world of appearances that Bridget Riley passionately objects to." End of the quote. Here, the double entendre of the word object should be emphasized, as it refers both to the action of a subject, or subjects, as it is passed on to viewers, and to the objects that embody them, entwining the subjective and the objective, intimacy and distance. Thank you.
Eric, thank you so much for an incredibly illuminating insight into Bridget Riley's fascinating practice and the way that you've taken us through the making of her paintings and her visual awareness and all of that that you have given us. So thank you so much. If there are any questions, we would love to hear from the audience now. And we have two helpers with the mics, so please raise your hand if you have anything to ask.
You can just forget the conclusion and we go back to... But if you want to speak about Riley and Derrida, I'm happy for that too.
Hello, thank you for a fascinating talk. And the two best artist talks I've been to were both given by the same artist, Bridget Riley. One was in Sydney and one was in Glasgow. So I was very excited to come and see the exhibition. But what really knocked me out was the sculpture that she made, I think in 1963. And I was just wondering if you could say anything about that piece that's in the show.
I haven't seen the show yet, so I would sort of, prudently abstain from any comment. I have to see it before I say anything.
Yeah, well, I thought it was a wonderful piece that, given that it was made in '63, I think it must be one of the most significant sculptures of the 20th century.
You're speaking about Continuum?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so you call it a sculpture, which is interesting, because I think it's not a sculpture. It's a painting environment. It was made as a series of continuous paintings. I mean, so Yeah, because I was trying to find out which sculpture you were speaking about, and I was ready for a complete discovery of an aspect of Riley's work I completely ignored, and I was very surprised.
Yeah, I was just using it as a shorthand because a painted environment or a three-dimensional work that you can enter both visually and physically. Yeah.
So I don't know how it is installed here. I saw it a long time ago in Strasbourg, I think, something like more than 10 years ago. So maybe my memories of it are not very fresh. I mean, they are not very fresh, and maybe you know how memory goes. So maybe I now imagine some aspect. But what I can say about it, in a way, is that it shows what Bridget Riley was trying to do at the time, which was creating this kind of complete environment. And you have also, about the same period, a little bit later, but some things for the theater, or then things for the hospitals, the two commissions for hospitals later. And it has something to do with this decentering I've been speaking about. So this kind of rotation where you have to go, you enter something and you're surrounded by painting and you're sort of lost in a way. What I think happens in this work is that in a way, but I have to refresh my memory, in a way it's a failure. And it is something that imposes itself too much on the viewer. You never lose the sense of what you're looking. I mean, the interesting thing, I don't know if I was clear in my lecture, but what I'm really interested in is the fact that you concentrate on something that's very objective, usually in her paintings, I mean, when confronting her paintings, and you never lose trace of the fact that it's an objective fact. But what happens is this kind of negotiation with yourself. And in Continuum, in a way, either you are overtly conscious of your own position in the work because you're fighting against it, or it's the work that takes everything and you're completely lost in it. And the fact that that she never replicated that. I mean, she did make a replica of the work itself, but she never tried to do it in any other way is I think, key to understanding how she herself, maybe she doesn't say that it's a failure, but it's a way to say that it doesn't work the way it should. And it's interesting that in the hospital commissions, I think, but I've never experienced them in the flesh. I only saw some models and while she was working on the later things and reproductions, you are facing a flat surface that maybe surrounds you, but you can, the way you're losing yourself with these stripes is something that's that is not this kind of battle between you and the work.
Yeah, thank you. I'd seen some work by Daniel Buren recently that seemed to have similarities, but what Bridget Riley was doing seemed to come decades earlier.
I'm not sure, to say the least. I mean, maybe in the way Buren has been contradicting himself by going into pure decoration. It shows how you can use some geometric tools just for enlivening a space, but without changing anything in the viewer, if I may be brutal.
Were there any other hands? I saw maybe a flicker of a hand in it. No? I wanted to ask you about this idea of that collaboration that you talk about in this idea of triological painting and the way in which we as the viewer are absolutely active. Could you say, because Bridget has talked about the viewer as a sort of active participant, and where that comes from in terms of her relation with Zura, which you touched on at the start of your talk?
I don't know, because I would have to go into many details, and I know my answers are too long. First thing, I think that Frances Follen brilliantly worked on that subject in her book about the 1960s work. I mean, beginning with for instance, the cartoons where you have the work sucking the viewer. I mean, you have some caricatures and cartoons about Riley's work where the viewer is literally sucked by the painting. And Riley herself, and I think very rightly so, has been speaking about the kind of space that's created by the paintings, or what she tries to achieve, which is this kind of space where you have sort of a middle ground between the painting itself and the viewer. It's as if the painting was coming forward into the space of the viewer, and the viewer was coming forward towards the painting, and that creates a space that's common to the painting and the viewer, which is this kind of specific thing that's happening. And in that sense, it's very different from, I mean, from this slide that you're seeing, it's very different from the way in Chevreul you just have an analysis of the relationship of colors. But it has something to do with it, which is this idea that Chevreul and many color theorists brought about, which is this idea that color in itself is something active that transforms the space around it in a way which is very specific. And when I say color, and you can see it, if you look at the whole book by Chevreul, it doesn't mean necessarily, it also includes black and white, of course.
Any other questions? Gentleman in the middle. I'm going to take the question there, and then there's one at the front. Thank you.
Hi, I'll probably bring the tone down a bit here. When you're talking about, you know, this three things of looking at it, and the interplay and all that, the word that comes to me, I only encountered Riley at that exhibition a couple of years ago down the road, right? And when I came out of it, the big thing I got out of it, I was born in the 60s, well, it was really buzzy, very, very buzzy, you know, visually. And also a lot of it left, one in particular actually, left me visually impaired in a sense for about 10 minutes afterwards, because it was like a veil had been drawn and a net had been put between me and reality. It was very, very strange. Now these I kind of put down to optical illusions, I suppose they are in a way, but is that what you're getting at when you talk about this things coming into you and it enveloping you and coming towards you and going away? There's also the thing, well, I'm bad at colour, right? But I see a lot of colour in like the curved ones, the curvy ones, loads of black and white. They're absolutely monochrome, but I see loads of colour in it. And again, I've never seen that anywhere else. And I've never seen that buzzy thing anywhere else, other than her work, apart from, you know, in other places. But in art, I've never seen that. And but that isn't what you were referring to, because that's kind of what I caught on to.
It's not really what I'm referring to. I think that's a moment in the work. I'm not very original in saying that. I mean, Ehrensweig said it in 1965. There's a moment of attack in a way, and then there is this negotiation with the viewer, and after a while, but it takes a lot of time actually, and it takes a lot of concentration on the work, in your relationship with the work. There's a stability is achieved. And what's interesting is in the latest works, either the stripes or the measure or the dots, the measure for measure series, it's nearly the contrary. It's as if at first you see the regular aspect of it, and then it becomes animated, and then after a while you reach a certain stability. But it's only through you accepting to enter this dialogue or trialogue that it can be reached. It's true, and maybe there are stronger works in her total output in this aspect. I don't know how to phrase it, but sometimes you just don't want to engage so much, and you're just taken by what seems to be an attack, and you just stop at that level, and that's why, she's been included in shows about op art and all that, and it would take a lot of time showing how. But I chose, when I paired her work in a slide with a work by Vasarely, I chose on purpose works that look very similar when you're looking at them in a reproduction. But if you look at the works themselves in the flesh, both works, they're incredibly different, and you can feel, you can understand why there is some relationship, and why it's possible to include Riley's work in op art exhibition. But there's something that happens in Riley, which is not this kind of buzzy aspect. I think you can see. I had a strange experience, and again, it's strange because I was not. I don't know how I end up saying things like that, but I'm going to say it. Nevertheless, I think it took me 15 minutes to see Vasarely retrospective at the Pompidou, and it was an exhibition with nearly 1,000 works. And it was because basically everything was about buzz and all that, and you get that very quickly. So the most interesting works is actually the works that's completely depersonalized and impersonalized, in the sense that it's made for posters or for advertisements or all that, and then they're completely successful, but you get them immediately. With Riley's work, it really takes a lot of time. At least it's my experience. Maybe it's because I'm more congenial to her work than to Vasarely. I don't know, but I promise I'll say something nice about a French artist.
Okay, so next time I see one at the exhibition, I'll look beyond the buzz, right? Just stay long.
And at the front, Ralph.
Hello, and thank you for your talk. I was just wondering, in terms of this decentering experience that you mentioned in looking at, say, Bridget's paintings, if you could say something about maybe the difference between, with Measure to Measure, a work on canvas versus looking at a wall painting, and whether you think there's any shift in what that decentering is like, if it's a...
There is and there isn't. There's a strange thing happening in the wall paintings, which is the fact, and I was, in a way, well, let's take this one. When I was preparing this lecture, I was wondering whether, for instance, when reproducing such a wall painting, I should blow it out to be in the whole slide, or just isolate it as if it was a painting. And I opted for that because my experience is that it's all the wall paintings, except maybe the hospital commissions, but that they are a little bit different, are actually rectangle things, and they have this picture quality. They still are tableaux in a way, even if they are playing with the space around them, but they don't behave very differently from the paintings. It's just the dimension and the scale. To my mind, but I'm happy to hear.
I think only at the edges.
What?
I think only at the edges of the tableau there's something different going on.
Yeah, that's true. Because they're opening up into something, and so you feel that there's no. It's strange because you do feel that there is a limit to what's happening, even if it's only the receding wall or something like that. But they are framed. I don't know. I don't know whether I'm clear about that. And of course, they're, because of their scale and because of this opening on every side, they have this quality. But you have that in some paintings too. When I first saw in a gallery exhibition the measure for measure paintings at Gallery Max Hetzler in Paris, you could see both the studies and the paintings. And the studies had this white margin. I mean, it's not properly a white margin because it's the same white that you have in the center, but it felt as some kind of white margin. And the effect was pretty strange because they were closer to what was happening in the wall paintings in a way, even if they were very small. The finalized paintings didn't have this white margin, and so you had a direct relationship between the corners of the paintings and the shapes. And I think that's something that you have, and it's interesting because I just said that the difference is in scale. So maybe it's not, it's in scale and not in dimension. It has to do, and I think you're perfectly right, with the corners, what happens on the sides, on all four sides, and this kind of decentering, which is actually a little bit more, a little bit stronger in the paintings than in the wall paintings, in a way. Strangely, because it should be the reverse. But as you see, I'm not very clear yet.
I'd like to ask something about her technique. I'm especially interested in the black and white paintings, and I would wonder if you can explain how you get the black so matte. The other thing that interests me...
I'm not a painter.
Well, you're a
painter.
student of Bridget Riley, so maybe you studied her technique, maybe. The other thing was a very interesting slide where she had a lot of small pieces of either cellulose or paper on the table in front of her. And how did she use those?
So I'm not going to be able to answer the first question. Basically, it's what she strives for and what she asks her assistant to do, and to have this kind of effect. And I guess it's done by carefully controlling the gestures and the brushes and the way you apply paint, and take paint out and all that. For what concerns the cutouts, she's been working with cutouts since the 1980s when she was doing the rhomboid paintings, as you can see in this picture. And it's a tool for, just as it's been for Matisse, it's a tool for assembling and deassembling things pretty quickly and working from pre-existing shapes and pre-existing colors rather than having to invent them completely. So even in the later curve paintings, it's done exactly in the same way. I had only bad photographs of the studio, and I refrained from using them from that period. But they are so it's done the same way. It means you have a model in the studio, and she can take part in, part out, and it gives birth to these very strange shapes that you have. If you look closely inside a painting like Rêve, you can see that there are these strange shapes that are actually the result of piecing together several of these cutout shapes. And that's basically, yeah, again, I think it's basically very much like the way Matisse used to work with cutout.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for everyone's questions. I think that concludes our lecture today, and I just want to say a huge thank you for Eric for being here. Please join me in thanking Eric.
Thanks a lot.